Most television shows produce a few celebrity guest spots across their long run. A famous voice, a wave at the camera, a line nobody really remembers a year later. The Simpsons has been collecting celebrity cameos for nearly 4 decades, and the list of the ones that ended badly just keeps growing. There is the pop star whose entire episode was deleted from one of the largest streaming services on Earth. There is the movie star whose half hour now reads as a warning the writers never meant to give. There is the pop singer whose appearance is still listed alongside historical disasters in the show's own internal jokes. There is the billionaire whose cameo the show now pretends never happened. There is the reluctant Beatle, the abusive guest at the recording booth, the baseball players whose careers got swallowed by their own animated counterparts, and the supporting actress who was killed off because of a flight from Denver to Los Angeles. Tonight, over the next couple of hours, this video walks slowly through the celebrity cameos the show could not save, the recordings that turned into nightmares, and the famous names that left Springfield with smaller reputations than the ones they walked in with. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Let's get started. The Vanished episode. There is a strange kind of loss that only happens to things people once loved in great numbers. A book goes of print and slowly becomes a rumor. A song is pulled from the shelves and survives only in the memories of the people who heard it young. Television, for most of its history, felt safe from that kind of disappearance, because once an episode aired, it seemed to belong to everyone, replayed forever, gathered onto discs, passed from one generation to the next. The Simpsons has produced more than 700 episodes across its enormous life, and nearly every one of them sits within easy reach, ready to be watched at any hour. There is one, though, that cannot be found in the usual places. One episode that was quietly lifted out of the collection and set aside, removed from the streaming library, scrubbed from the discs, pulled from the reruns. It is the very first episode of the 3rd season, and the reason it vanished has everything to do with the famous voice hidden inside it. To understand the disappearance, the night has to drift back to a much gentler moment, to the autumn of 1991, when the episode first arrived and the world received it warmly. The Simpsons was still young then, still the edgy new arrival rather than the aging institution it would become. Landing a major celebrity for a guest spot was a real coup, and the show landed one of the biggest stars on the planet. The episode was called Stark Raving Dad, and the story it told was simple and sweet in the way the early show often was. The plot begins with a small misunderstanding that spirals, the way Homer's life always does. He wears a pink shirt to work, the shirt having been dyed pink by accident in the wash, and at the nuclear plant, this small splash of color marks him out as some kind of dangerous free thinker. A quick and careless evaluation lands him in a mental institution. There, in the quiet of the hospital, Homer meets a very large, very gentle man with a soft, unmistakable voice. The man calmly explains that he is Michael Jackson. He sings in that famous style, he speaks in that famous way, and Homer, who has no real idea what the actual pop star looks like, simply believes him. The two become friends, and Homer brings him home to Springfield. What follows is one of the warmer stories of the early seasons. The whole town gathers, expecting to meet the real Michael Jackson, and the gentle giant cannot bring himself to disappoint a young, heartbroken Lisa, who is furious with her brother and her family. To make peace, he helps Bart write a birthday song for his sister, a tender little tune that became one of the most beloved musical moments the show ever produced. Only at the end does the truth come out. The soft-spoken man finally admits that he is a bricklayer from New Jersey named Leon Kompowski, a sad and lonely soul who had simply come to believe he was the most famous singer in the world. Having helped the family, and having found his own voice again, he walks back out of their lives. The casting was a genuine secret at the time, and it stayed a secret for years. Michael Jackson was a devoted fan of the show, and he wanted to take part, but his involvement came wrapped in unusual conditions. He agreed to lend his voice only if he was left uncredited, and so the performance was attributed in the credits to a made-up name, a certain John J. Smith. There was also a contractual complication that kept him from doing the singing himself. For the actual songs, the production brought in a sound-alike performer named Kip Lennon, whose voice stood in for the stars during the musical numbers. By some accounts, Jackson found a private amusement in this arrangement, delighting in the idea that the trick might fool even the people closest to him into thinking he had sung the parts himself. For a long while afterward, audiences only suspected the voice belonged to him. The confirmation that it truly had been Michael Jackson came years later. The episode carried a second small piece of history that has nothing to do with its eventual disappearance, a detail worth pausing on simply because it captures how the show once operated. Around that time, the sitting president of the United States made a speech in which he said the country should work to make American families a great deal more like a wholesome old television family, and a great deal less like The Simpsons. The show responded with the speed and cheek that defined it. For a rerun of of this very episode, the producers added a brief new opening in which the cartoon family sits watching that real speech, and the young son turns to the others and points out that they are, in fact, just like the wholesome family the president praised, since they too are praying for an end to hard times. It was a quick, confident jab at the most powerful man in the world, slipped into the front of an episode about a man who believed he was a pop star, and it shows how nimble and fearless the early show could be. For years, Stark Raving Dad lived comfortably as one of the cherished early episodes. The birthday song became a small cultural fixture, sung at real birthdays by people who had grown up with the show. When Michael Jackson died in the summer of 2009, the network even brought the episode back for a special broadcast, airing it again as a tribute to the late singer. At that point, its place in the collection seemed permanent. It was a fan favorite with a famous secret and a beautiful song, the kind of episode that gets passed down rather than thrown away. Then the ground shifted. In early 2019, a documentary was released that gathered detailed and disturbing accounts from two men who said they had been sexually abused by Michael Jackson when they were children. The film was called Leaving Neverland, and its effect on the singer's legacy was immediate and severe. A wave of reassessment swept across everything connected to him, and the people who ran The Simpsons found themselves looking at one of their own beloved episodes through entirely new eyes. The decision came quickly. The show's longtime executive producer, James L. Brooks, along with the creator Matt Groening and the veteran producer Al Jean, who had also co-written the episode, watched the documentary and concluded together that the episode had to go. Brooks explained that the film had presented evidence of monstrous behavior, and that pulling the episode felt like the only choice they could make. He described the team as being completely of one mind on the matter, a group of people who normally spent their lives arguing over the smallest jokes, now unanimous and certain. Al Jean spoke even more pointedly, suggesting that Jackson might have used a guest appearance like this one on a show beloved by children as a way to reach and groom young boys. That possibility, more than anything, made the episode impossible for them to keep in circulation, so the episode was removed. In March of 2019, it was pulled from streaming services, from syndicated television, from the on-demand library, and from all future physical releases. The disappearance was thorough. When the third season was reprinted on disc, the episode was cut out entirely, so that the set now opened with a different installment. The second episode quietly promoted to the first, as though the original premiere had never existed. When the entire history of the show later found its permanent home on a major streaming platform, every episode from the first 30 seasons was made available except this single one. Out of more than 700 episodes, it became the only one that fans could not call up with a click. The reasoning the producers gave was careful and humane. They framed the removal as an act of compassion toward the people who had come forward in the documentary, a refusal to keep promoting the voice and image of a man now credibly accused of terrible things against children. Brooks offered a small, telling comparison when he spoke about the decision. He said that he was not in favor of erasing history wholesale, of pretending a thing had never happened, the way a book burning tries to wipe out knowledge itself. But he added that this show was their own book, and that they were allowed to remove a single chapter from it if they chose. The episode was their creation, and they had decided they no longer wished to share it. The response from the audience was divided, as these things always are. A great many fans felt the loss keenly. For them, the episode was a piece of their childhood, a gentle story with a gorgeous song, and the man who had voiced the gentle giant was, in the fiction, not even really Michael Jackson at all, but a sad bricklayer from New Jersey. They argued that punishing a sweet episode for the crimes of the person behind one of its voices felt like a strange kind of justice, one that hurt the fans more than it touched the long-dead star. Others felt the producers had done the right thing, that there was something genuinely uncomfortable about continuing to circulate a children's favorite built around the voice of a man accused of preying on children. The debate had no clean answer, and the producers themselves seemed to feel the weight of it, caught between their love for their own work and their unwillingness to keep lending it to a tarnished name. What makes the whole episode such a fitting place to begin this long night is the completeness of its vanishing. Most of the troubled cameos ahead of us tonight are still there to be watched, awkward and aged but present, available to anyone who wants to revisit them. Stark Raving Dad is different. It has been deliberately lifted out of reach, removed from the easy channels, cut from the discs, left off the streaming shelves. The only ways to see it now involve old copies pressed before the removal, discs that fans hunt for secondhand, the leftover traces of a thing that was once everywhere and is now carefully kept out of sight. A beloved episode of the most rerun show in television history has been turned, by the choice of its own makers, into something close to a ghost. There is a quiet irony folded into the story, and it deserves to be noticed gently. The episode itself is about a man pretending to be Michael Jackson, a man who is eventually revealed to be someone else entirely, a lonely imposter who only believed in the fantasy. And now the episode survives in the world as a kind of imposter too, present in memory but absent from the shelves, talked about constantly yet impossible to find in the ordinary way. The fiction was about a false Michael Jackson who turned out to be a gentle nobody. The reality became a beloved cartoon erased because the real Michael Jackson turned out to be something far darker than the public once believed. The disappearance also marked a small turning point in how the show would come to regard its own celebrity guests. For most of its early life, a famous cameo was simply a prize, a feather in the cap, a sign that the show had arrived. Landing Michael Jackson in 1991 was treated as a triumph. The slow unraveling of that triumph, the way a celebrated guest spot curdled over the decades into something the makers felt they had to hide, was an early lesson in the danger of tying a piece of art too tightly to a living, fallible, sometimes monstrous human being. The show had welcomed a star, and the star had left behind a stain that no amount of warmth in the writing could wash away. Tonight that stain is only the first of many. The pattern that begins with Stark raving dad, the pattern of a famous guest whose later reality reaches back and poisons the work they touched, will repeat itself again and again across the hours ahead, in different forms and with different names. Some of those guests damaged their own reputations. Some had their reputations damaged for them by time and circumstance. And some, as the next part of the night will show, walked into the recording booth as heroes admired by millions, only to have their cartoon counterparts become tangled up in the messy, unpredictable fates of their real careers. The story of the vanished episode is the story of a single voice that became impossible to keep. What comes next is the story of 9 of them at once. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the first lost cameo is a beloved episode quietly erased by its own creators. A gentle story about a false Michael Jackson removed because of the truth about the real one. From a single hidden voice, we now turn to a whole team of famous faces gathered into one episode. Next, we step onto the baseball field for Homer at the Bat. Section 2. The Curse of Homer at the Bat. Most athletes are remembered for what they did on the field. A great hitter is remembered for his swing, a great pitcher for the speed of his arm, and when their playing days end, the memory of those feats slowly fades into record books and old highlight reels. Being drawn into a cartoon is a different kind of fame. It is smaller and stranger and, in its own way, far more durable. A man can win championships and earn a place in the Hall of Fame, and yet, for a whole generation, the most vivid thing about him remains the 30 seconds he spent as a cartoon, doing something absurd in an episode of a comedy show. That is exactly what happened to 9 of the biggest names in American baseball, all at once in a single half-hour broadcast in the winter of 1992. The episode is called Homer at the Bat, and it stands today as one of the most beloved things the show ever made. Its premise grew out of a simple wish from one of the show's founders, a producer named Sam Simon, who wanted to build an episode stuffed with real Major League Baseball players. The writers around him were doubtful. The task of convincing 9 famous athletes, men with busy seasons and full lives, to come into a recording booth and make fun of themselves seemed close to impossible. Some of the staff privately guessed they might manage to land 3 at the very most. The episode was written by John Swartzwelder, a man with a deep love of baseball, and against all the quiet doubt, the production somehow secured all 9. The story itself is pure early Simpsons. Homer and his co-workers at the nuclear plant have built a surprisingly good softball team, good enough to reach the league final. Mr. Burns, the plant's ancient and ruthless owner, makes an enormous wager with the owner of a rival plant in the neighboring town, betting a fortune on the outcome of the game. To guarantee his victory, Burns does what a man of his wealth and contempt would naturally do. He hires 9 professional baseball stars, gives them token jobs at the plant so they technically qualify for the company team, and plans to bench his loyal but useless real employees in favor of the ringers. The plan is monstrous and petty in the way Burns always is, and it sets the whole machine of the episode in motion. The 9 men who agreed to play exaggerated versions of themselves were among the brightest stars of the era. There was Ken Griffey Jr., then a fresh-faced young phenomenon on his way to greatness. There was Jose Canseco, in the middle of a monster season, one of the most feared hitters in the game, Roger Clemens, Wade Boggs, Don Mattingly, Steve Sachs, Mike Scioscia, Ozzie Smith, and Darryl Strawberry rounded out the lineup, a collection of talent that included future Hall of Famers and household names. Getting them into a studio was its own slow miracle. Because the players were scattered across the country and bound to their teams, the recordings had to be gathered over roughly 6 months, captured piece by piece whenever a player happened to be in Los Angeles to face the local clubs. The genius of the episode, and the reason it it has lasted is that almost none of the great players actually get to play. One by one, in the hours before the big game, each ringer is removed from the board by some bizarre and specific misfortune, and the comedy lives entirely in the strangeness of how each man falls. The episode treats its famous guests not as heroes to be flattered, but as victims of an escalating series of cartoon disasters, and the willingness of these proud athletes to be humiliated so thoroughly is a large part of the charm. Consider the fates the writers handed them. Ken Griffey Jr. develops an addiction to an old-fashioned nerve tonic, drinking so much of it that his head swells up to a grotesque size and he can no longer function. Steve Sachs, driving through Springfield, is pulled over by the police and absurdly charged with every unsolved crime in the city, hauled off to jail on the eve of the game. Roger Clemens visits a hypnotist meant to fill the team with confidence, and the hypnotism goes wrong, leaving the great pitcher convinced that he is a chicken, clucking and flapping and pecking at the ground. Mike Scioscia, who genuinely enjoys the manual labor at the plant, suffers radiation poisoning from the work and ends up in the hospital. Wade Boggs gets into a heated argument at the local tavern over which figure was truly the greatest British Prime Minister, and the disagreement ends with him knocked out cold by Homer's friend Barney. Two of the fates carry small, real-world stories behind them that make them even stranger. Don Mattingly's downfall in the episode comes from Mr. Burns repeatedly and irrationally ordering him to trim his sideburns. Mattingly shaves more and more of his hair to satisfy the old man, who keeps insisting the sideburns are still there, until the player is finally thrown off the team over hair he no longer has. What makes this peculiar is what happened afterward in real life. The episode was recorded before any of it occurred, yet within about a year, Mattingly was benched by his real team's manager in a genuine dispute over his refusal to cut his hair. The cartoon had mocked him for a hair-related benching, and then reality delivered one. Mattingly himself has spoken about how odd the coincidence felt, as though the writers had somehow known what was coming, though of course they could not have. The story behind Jose Canseco's scene is quieter and more revealing about the recording process. In the original script, Canseco's character was given a comic, romantic entanglement, a flirtation with Bart's teacher that drew on a famous baseball film of the time. By several accounts, Canseco's wife objected to the idea of her husband being shown in that light, and so the writers rewrote the entire sequence. In the version that aired, Canseco is delayed before the game because he is heroically rescuing belongings from a burning house, carrying out furniture and even a piano. The model spouse turned into the model neighbor. The change turned a joke at his expense into something almost flattering, and it shows how much the personalities and preferences of the real guests shaped what ended up on screen. Not every recording went smoothly. The writers later described Canseco's session in the booth as a difficult one. Ken Griffey Jr., still young, reportedly struggled with one of his stranger lines, a surreal bit of dialogue about a party taking place inside his own mouth to which everyone was invited, and grew frustrated trying to make sense of it. Others took to the work instantly. Mike Scioscia, by his own telling, agreed to appear almost the moment he was asked, embracing the silliness without hesitation. And Ozzie Smith, whose character in the episode tumbles into a local tourist trap called the Springfield Mystery Spot and is never seen again, swallowed by the strange attraction, later joked that he would happily come back to the show one day, if only so his character could finally climb out of the place that had trapped him. In the end, only one of the 9 great players actually steps onto the field for the championship game. Darryl Strawberry takes Homer's position and proceeds to hit home run after home run, 9 of them in all, a one-man wrecking crew. But even his triumph is undone by Mr. Burns. In the final inning, with the game on the line, Burns pulls Strawberry from the lineup for a baffling tactical reason, wanting a right-handed batter to face the other team's left-handed pitcher, and sends the hapless Homer into bat instead. Homer, lost in a daydream, is struck in the head by the pitch and knocked senseless, and because the bases were loaded, that blow to the skull forces in the winning run. The great athlete is benched so that the fool can win the game by being hit in the head. It is a perfect ending for the show. The powerful and famous swept aside so that the ordinary idiot can stumble into glory. The episode closes with a gentle song, a soft parody of an old baseball anthem, written by the musician Terry Cashman, that walks through the fates of all 9 players in turn, a calm and almost tender summary of the chaos that just unfolded. It is the kind of ending that turns a comedy episode into something people remember fondly for decades, and they have. The legacy of Homer at the bat reaches far beyond the show itself. Years later, the Baseball Hall of Fame honored the episode on its 25th anniversary, gathering some of the players and the show's producers to celebrate it, a remarkable thing for an institution devoted to real athletic greatness to do for a cartoon. Several of the men who lent their voices went on to be enshrined in that very hall for their actual careers. For a comedy episode to be embraced erased by the temple of the sport it gently mocked says a great deal about how deeply it landed. But the title of this section speaks of a curse, and the curse is real in its own quiet way. For a good number of these players, the cartoon version of themselves became more famous and more lasting than much of what they did on the field. A casual fan today might not be able to recite Steve Sax's statistics, but they remember the cartoon version arrested for every crime in Springfield. They might not recall the details of Roger Clemens' seasons, but they remember the pitcher who thought he was a chicken. The animated counterpart swallowed the men, in the sense that the brief, silly cartoon became the most vivid image many people hold of them. For some of the 9, the years after the episode brought real trouble that made the contrast even sharper. The era they played in would later become known as a deeply tainted one in the sport, an age clouded by the use of banned performance-enhancing drugs, and several of the men in that animated lineup found their real reputations entangled in those public controversies as the decades passed. Jose Canseco in particular became closely associated with the unmasking of that era, writing openly about it in ways that reshaped how the public saw him. Darryl Strawberry's life after baseball was marked by well-documented struggles with addiction and legal trouble before his later recovery. The cheerful cartoon that had frozen these men in a single goofy moment in 1992 sat oddly against the messier, harder stories that real life would write for some of them afterward. That contrast is the strange heart of the episode's afterlife. In Homer at the Bat, the players are forever young, forever stars, forever caught in a moment of harmless absurdity, swelling heads and chicken impressions and tumbles into tourist traps. The real men kept living, kept aging, and some of them kept falling, in ways the gentle cartoon could never have predicted. The episode preserved them like insects in amber, smiling and silly, while time carried their real selves off into far more complicated places. For a generation of viewers, the amber version is the one that stuck. There is something fitting in the fact that the show chose to humiliate its famous guests rather than worship them. The early Simpsons understood that the funniest thing to do with a celebrity was to knock them down a peg, to drown them in nerve tonic and lock them in jail and turn them into chickens, and the players who agreed to it were good sports who understood the joke. That instinct, the instinct to mock rather than to flatter, was a sign of a show at the height of its confidence. It is also exactly the instinct that the show would later lose, and the loss of it sits at the center of the next part of the night, because there came a time when the show stopped knocking its famous guests down and started bowing to them instead, handing over whole episodes as gifts to the stars who appeared in them. The result was a pair of cameos so fawning, so swollen, that the show itself would eventually treat them as low points in its own long history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the second story is a field full of famous athletes turned into cartoon casualties, frozen forever in a single silly moment while their real lives moved on toward far stranger ends. From a show confident enough to mock its biggest guests, we now turn to a show that began to worship them instead. Next, we look at the 2 cameos that swallowed entire episodes. Section 3, the cameo that ate the show. There is a moment in the life of any long-running series when its relationship with fame begins to change. In its hungry early years, a show treats a famous guest as raw material, something to be played with, mocked, knocked off a pedestal for the amusement of the audience. Later, when the show itself has become powerful and a little tired, the dynamic can quietly reverse. The famous guest stops being the target and becomes the prize, and the episode bends itself around them, eager to please, anxious to flatter. The whole half hour turns into a gift wrapped and handed to the celebrity, with the regular characters pushed gently aside to make room. The Simpsons reached that point more than once, and 2 episodes in particular show the change so clearly and so painfully that the show itself would later treat them as low marks in its own long history. The first of the 2 arrived in the spring of 2012, in an episode built entirely around the pop star Lady Gaga. At the time, she was one of the most famous performers alive, a singer known for enormous spectacle, outrageous costumes, and a devoted global following. The episode was titled Lisa Goes Gaga, and the premise reached for emotion and landed somewhere closer to worship. Lisa, the show's thoughtful and often lonely middle child, is suffering through a deep stretch of low self-esteem, bullied at school and miserable at home. Springfield itself is presented as a town drowning in sadness, and into this gloom rides Lady Gaga, who, in the logic of the episode, possesses a kind of psychic sense for human unhappiness. She halts her touring train in Springfield specifically to lift the spirits of the town and, above all, to rescue Lisa from her despair. What unfolds across the half hour is less a story than a long act of reverence. From the moment the singer arrives, the people of Springfield treat her with something close to holy awe. The episode showers her with admiration, lingers on her costumes and her performances, and bends the usually sharp-tongued town into a crowd of adoring fans. Lisa, normally the show's voice of intelligence and independence, is reduced to one more starstruck admirer waiting to be uplifted. The jabs that the show would once have aimed at such an enormous ego are soft to the point of vanishing. There are a handful of strange flourishes scattered through it, a kiss shared with Marge, a moment where Homer nibbles at the edible costume the star wears, but these oddities only underline how completely the episode has handed itself over to its guest. The reception was brutal, and it has not softened with time. Lisa Goes Gaga became widely regarded as one of the worst episodes the show had ever produced, and by some measures, the very worst. On the largest public rating site, it sank to a score that no Simpsons episode had reached before, the first to fall below the midpoint of the scale. Critics and longtime fans described it in nearly identical terms. They called it a 22-minute advertisement for the singer, an episode with no real plot, a showcase that pushed the actual family and the rich supporting cast to the margins so that a celebrity could shine. The most pointed complaint cut to the heart of what the show had always been. This was a series where nothing was sacred, where every figure of power or fame was fair game for mockery, and here it was treating a pop star with a reverence it had never granted to anyone, least of all to its own characters. Curiously, even many of the harshest critics admitted that the singer herself performed well within the episode. The problem was never her effort. The problem was that the show had stopped being itself in order to flatter her. There is a small, sharp irony buried in the episode's ending. The story had opened with Lisa being bullied, made small and miserable by cruel classmates. By the close, after all the uplift and adoration, Lisa is the one who effectively drives the singer out of town, turning on her benefactor in a way that undercuts the entire message the episode had spent half an hour building. A story that began as a plea against bullying ended with its heroine bullying the very star who had come to save her. The whole thing collapsed under the weight of its own confusion. The most telling judgment on the episode, though, came years later from the show itself. In a much later season, the writers slipped in a brief joke in which a Springfield character, listing the most shameful moments in the town's entire history, names Lady Gaga's visit alongside one of the town's great civic disasters. The show rarely refers back to its own past this directly, and when it chose to do so here, it placed the Gaga cameo in the company of catastrophe, ranking it among the darkest chapters of Springfield's life. The series had effectively confessed, in its own voice and through its own characters, that the episode had been a mistake. A guest appearance that had once been promoted as a major event was now treated by its own creators as a thing to be ashamed of, a stain on the town's record. If the Gaga episode showed the show worshipping a pop star, the second of these two cameos showed it worshipping a billionaire, and that one would age even more strangely. In early 2015, the show built an entire episode around the technology entrepreneur Elon Musk, a man then celebrated mainly as a brilliant inventor and the public face of electric cars and private rockets. The episode, titled The Musk Who Fell to Earth, follows the same flattering pattern. Musk descends into Springfield in a spacecraft searching for inspiration and quickly forms a close friendship with Homer. In a flattering twist, Homer's foolish, half-formed thoughts somehow spark genius inventions in Musk's mind, and the inventor proceeds to transform the town, handing out self-driving electric cars and revolutionizing the nuclear plant. The episode treats Musk with the same hushed admiration the Gaga episode gave its star. The townspeople regard him as a kind of savior, a visionary descended from the heavens to improve their lives. There are strange detours scattered through it, including an entire subplot in which Homer adopts a bald eagle, nurses it back to health, and then watches it get incinerated by Musk's arriving spacecraft. A moment so odd that some viewers wondered whether they had wandered into a Halloween special by mistake. The plot mostly serves as a frame on which to hang the inventor's brilliance. By the end, after Mr. Burns engineers his removal because the improvements are costing the plant money, Musk floats back into space, reminiscing fondly about his friendship with Homer and shedding a single tear as he goes. The producers were aware, even at the time, of the danger of fawning. The show's longtime guiding producer Al Jean said afterward that they had made an effort not to turn the episode into a simple act of flattery and pointed to jabs the script took at the inventor's enormous ego. Musk himself was a genuine fan of the show, and his appearance came about after a meeting with one of the series' founders, who came away convinced he wanted a cartoon version of the man on the program. The episode drew a healthy audience, the largest the network had that night. There was even a piece of direct product placement folded into the ending, a moment showing Musk playing the show's own mobile game, an app that would itself be shut down years later, leaving that scene looking even more dated than it already did. The initial reaction to the Musk episode was was lukewarm rather than savage. It was seen as a weak, overlong showcase, much in the mold of the Gaga episode, another half hour that existed mainly so a famous person could appear and be admired. But the truly remarkable thing about The Musk Who Fell to Earth is how its reputation collapsed in the years that followed, and why. In the time since it aired, the man at its center became one of the most polarizing public figures in the world. His business decisions, his very public ownership of a major social media platform, and his deep involvement in politics turned him from a widely admired inventor into a figure who provokes strong and divided feelings everywhere he went. An episode that had once been a gentle, admiring portrait of a beloved genius came to look, to many viewers, like an embarrassing monument to a man the culture now argued about constantly. As a result, the episode has quietly become one of the most disowned things the show ever made. Many fans now refuse to acknowledge it at all, treating it as if it never happened, scrubbing it from their own private sense of what the show is. The people who run the series have, by all appearances, done much the same. The events of that episode are never referenced, never built upon, never woven back into the ongoing life of the town. A whole half hour built around one of the most famous people alive has been left to sit in silence, unmentioned and unwanted. The cameo the show now pretends never occurred. Where the Gaga episode was openly mocked by its own creators, the Musk episode received an even quieter and perhaps more damning fate. It was simply forgotten on purpose. Set side by side, these two episodes tell a single story about a show that lost its nerve. The early Simpsons had drowned baseball stars in nerve tonic and turned a famous pitcher into a chicken, confident that the funniest thing to do with fame was to puncture it. The later Simpsons, faced with a pop star and a billionaire, chose instead to kneel, to build shining temples around its guests, and let the regular characters fade into the background. In both cases, the guest swallowed the show. The episode stopped being about Springfield and became about the celebrity, and audiences felt the difference immediately, registering it as a kind of betrayal of what the show was supposed to be. The deeper lesson sits in how badly both cameos aged, and how openly the show came to regret them. A flattering portrait is a fragile thing. It depends entirely on the subject staying admirable, and people rarely stay frozen in the moment a cartoon captures them. The Pop Stars episode was hated almost immediately for its emptiness. The Billionaires episode was tolerated at first and then slowly poisoned by the changing reputation of the man it celebrated. Either way, the show learned the same hard truth twice. When a series stops mocking the powerful and starts worshipping them, it puts itself at the mercy of people it cannot control, and it ties its own work to reputations that may not survive the years. That truth leads directly into the next part of the night and into one of the most fascinating cameos in the show's entire history, because there was a third famous guest, a beloved movie star at the very height of his fame, whose episode tried to do something cleverer than simple worship. It built a story around the very idea of a celebrity who was flattered too much, a man so adored that no one will ever tell him the truth. At the time, it played as gentle satire. In the decades since, as the real man's life took a dark and troubling turn, that same episode began to read like a warning the writers never knew they were giving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the third story is a pair of cameos that swallowed whole episodes. Two famous guests so worshipped that the show itself later marked both as mistakes. From episodes that flattered their stars too plainly, we now turn to one that flattered with a twist. Next, we sit with the movie star whose half hour became an accidental warning. Section 4. The Warning. Inside Beyond Blunderdome. Flattery is one of the quiet dangers of power. The more famous and adored a person becomes, the harder it grows for anyone around them to speak an honest word. People want to please the powerful, to stay in their good graces, to bask in the warmth of their attention, and so they smile and nod and tell the great person exactly what the great person wishes to hear. Over time, this can curdle into something genuinely harmful. A man surrounded only by agreement loses the ability to hear no. He drifts further from the truth with every passing year, insulated by the very admiration that the world keeps heaping upon him. There was once an episode of The Simpsons built around precisely this danger, and it chose, as the subject of its lesson, one of the most beloved movie stars on Earth. At the time, it played as clever satire. In the decades since, it has come to read like a warning the writers never knew they were giving. The episode opened the 11th season, arriving in the autumn of 1999, and it carried a small piece of behind-the-scenes significance. It was the first episode written by Mike Scully after he took over as the person running the show, the captain stepping onto the bridge for the first time. The guest at its center was Mel Gibson, then near the very peak of his fame, an actor and director adored by audiences and showered with awards. The kind of star whose name alone alone could fill a theater. The story begins, as so many do, with one of Homer's small disasters. He takes a new electric car for a test drive in order to claim a free gift, and naturally destroys the vehicle in the process. The reward he earns turns out to be 2 tickets to an advanced screening of Mel Gibson's newest film, a remake of a classic old movie about an honest man fighting corruption in the halls of government. Marge, who carries a deep crush on the star, is thrilled. At the screening, the entire audience falls into rapture. They adore the film, they adore the man, and they fill out their comment cards with glowing, gushing praise. Every card overflows with admiration, save one. Homer, with his usual complete absence of tact, writes a savage and honest review, tearing the movie apart without a shred of politeness. That single honest card is the engine of the whole episode. When Gibson reads the pile of comment cards and finds, among the endless flattery, one furious and brutally frank assessment, he is electrified. Here, at last, is a person who will tell him the truth. The premise the episode builds around him is sharp and a little sad. Gibson explains that the great curse of his life is that everyone loves him too much to ever be honest with him. He describes a world in which his fame smooths away every consequence, where he can break the speed limit without ever receiving a ticket, where even his unpaid taxes are somehow handled for him by the authorities rather than held against him. He calls it a kind of private misery, this life inside a bubble of endless approval, and he longs for someone who will simply look him in the eye and tell him when he is wrong. So he seeks out Homer, the one man tactless enough to be useful. Gibson flies to Springfield, recruits Homer to help him improve the film, and the two of them travel to Hollywood together. What follows is a comic catastrophe. Homer's notion of improving the movie is to drown it in violence, and the two men reshoot the ending so that the once gentle hero goes on a bloody rampage through the seat of government. A finale so absurd and over the top that the studio is horrified. When the executives try to bury the new cut, Homer and Gibson steal the film reel and flee, leading to a chase. The violent version is finally shown to an audience, and they hate it. By the end, Gibson, having had his fill of Homer's terrible instincts, simply shoves him out of a moving limousine, the friendship dissolved, the honest man no longer worth the trouble. By all accounts, the real Mel Gibson was a thoroughly good sport about the whole thing. He reportedly spent more time in the recording booth with the cast than most guests of his stature bothered to, and even returned for additional sessions, throwing himself into the work. The script gently teased his image, his looks, his action movie reputation, and he seemed to enjoy playing along, willing to laugh at a cartoon version of himself. For a star of his enormous fame to participate so generously and to allow the show to poke at him suggested a man comfortable enough with his own legend to let it be deflated a little. The cleverness of the episode, the thing that set it apart from the simpler celebrity worship that would come later, is that it did not merely flatter its guest. It built an entire story around the idea of a celebrity being flattered too much. The episode understood, on some level, that the real danger to a powerful and adored man is the disappearance of honest voices around him. It dramatized the loneliness of fame, the way constant approval can rot a person's grip on reality, the hunger a cosseted star might feel for a single unvarnished truth. At the time, this all played as light, knowing satire, a gentle joke about the strange isolation of the very famous, delivered with the star himself in on the joke. And then the years did their work, and the satire turned into something heavier. In the time after the episode aired, the real Mel Gibson's life took a dark and very public turn. In the middle of the next decade, he was arrested for drunk driving, and during that arrest, he unleashed a stream of anti-Semitic remarks that made headlines around the world. In the years that followed, leaked recordings surfaced in which he was heard making abusive and bigoted statements, and he faced serious allegations of domestic violence. The beloved star of 1999, the man whom everyone adored too much to criticize, revealed sides of himself that the adoring public had never imagined. His reputation, once golden, collapsed under the weight of his own conduct. Watched in the light of all that came after, the episode transforms. The premise that once seemed like gentle satire now reads like an unintended diagnosis. Here was a story explicitly about a powerful, beloved man whom no one would ever hold to account. A man so insulated by fame that the truth could not reach him. A man whose every transgression was smoothed over by an adoring world. The episode joked that Gibson could speed without consequence and skip his taxes without penalty because everyone loved him too much to stop him. Years later, the real man behaved as though the normal rules did not apply to him, shielded for a long time by the very fame the episode had described. The writers had built a comedy around the dangers of a celebrity surrounded only by yes men, and then reality supplied the dark ending that the comedy had only hinted at. Several people who have looked back on the episode have noted how strange it now feels to hear that cartoon version of Gibson lament that nobody will ever be honest with him a lament that, in hindsight, points straight at the trouble to come. The episode contains one more small example of how unpredictably jokes about real people can age, and it cuts in the opposite direction. Tucked into the background is a gag referencing another actor who, at the time, was struggling publicly with addiction and repeated brushes with the law, a man whose career then seemed to be unraveling. The joke treated his troubles as a punchline, but that actor went on to recover, to rebuild his life, and to become one of the most beloved and successful performers in the world. His early struggles transformed into a celebrated comeback story. So the same episode that accidentally foretold one star's fall also mocked another star who would go on to rise far beyond anyone's expectations. The jokes the writers tossed off about real people in 1999 aged in wildly different directions, one curdling into a warning, the other rendered obsolete by an unlikely redemption. That unpredictability is the real lesson sitting underneath Beyond Blunderdome. When a show ties its comedy to living people, it surrenders control of what those jokes will eventually mean. The writers could not have known what Mel Gibson would later say and do. They could not have known that their gentle satire about an over-flattered star would come to look like a quiet prophecy. They could not have known that their throwaway joke about a troubled young actor would be erased by his triumphant return. They simply wrote what was funny in the moment, and time did the rest, reshaping their work in ways they never intended and could never have foreseen. There is something almost eerie, though the investigative spirit of this part of the night resists dwelling on it, in how precisely the episode captured the mechanism of a celebrity's downfall before the downfall occurred. The show did not predict anything. It had no special knowledge. What it did was understand a timeless truth about power and flattery, and apply that truth to a famous man, and then watch as the famous man lived out the very pattern the show had described. A person whom no one will correct is a person in danger, and the danger does not announce itself in advance. It simply grows, quietly, behind the wall of adoration, until one day it breaks into the open. The episode also marks a kind of high point in the show's handling of fame, a moment when it could still build something thoughtful around a celebrity rather than simply kneeling before one. Beyond Blunderdome flattered Gibson in some ways, allowing him to be handsome and charming and self-aware, but it also planted a genuine idea inside the flattery, a real observation about the corrosive effect of endless praise. That balance, that ability to both welcome a star and quietly critique the condition of stardom itself, is more than the later worshipful cameos ever managed. The episode at least had something to say. What it could not control was its own guest. And that brings the first half of the night toward its close, because the troubles with famous guests do not end with the ones whose reputations later soured on screen. Some of the most revealing stories happened far from the finished episode, in the small, soundproofed rooms where the voices were actually recorded. There were guests who arrived glum and unwilling, treating the whole affair as beneath them. There were guests who behaved badly the moment the microphone was on, rude to the people trying to direct them. And there was a beloved member of the show's own world who vanished from Springfield forever, not because of any story the writers wanted to tell, but because of a quiet dispute over money and the cost of a plane ticket. The trouble with celebrity, as the final stretch of this first half will show, often began long before the cameras or the cartoon ever rolled. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the fourth story is a cameo that mocked the danger of a flattered star and then watched, helplessly, as its own guest lived out the warning in real life. From a celebrity whose trouble arrived years later, we now move behind the scenes, into the recording booth itself. Next we meet the difficult guests and the quiet dispute that killed a beloved character. Section 5. The Trouble Behind the Microphone. A finished cartoon is a smooth and frictionless thing. The voices flow, the timing snaps, the performances seem effortless, and the audience watching at home has no sense at all of how the sound was made. Behind that polish, though, lies a small, soundproofed room, a microphone, a director on the other side of the glass, and a human being who may be tired or bored or rude or simply unwilling to be there. The booth is where the real personalities show themselves, stripped of makeup and lighting and the protections of fame. Most of the trouble with celebrity on The Simpsons did not happen in the episodes at all. It happened in those quiet rooms and sometimes in the negotiations around them. And the stories that leaked out over the years reveal a side of the famous guests that the cheerful finished product never showed. One of the most telling of these stories involves a genuine Hollywood legend, an actor of enormous stature who had been a giant of the screen for decades. Kirk Douglas, the star of grand old epics and a 3-time nominee for the highest awards in film, was brought in to voice a character in a mid-90s episode. The role was a good one, a homeless old man named Chester Lampwick, who turns out to be the true, long-cheated credited creator of a famous cartoon character, a part with real comic dignity to it. The casting was inspired. The recording session, by the account that later emerged, was a small ordeal. The story comes from the woman who voices Bart, Nancy Cartwright, who described the day in the memoir she wrote about her years on the show. By her telling, Douglas made his lack of interest plain from the moment he arrived. He pulled up to the studio in a limousine and instructed the driver to keep the engine running, announcing that the whole thing would not take long. Once inside, he took off the headphones the actors wear to hear direction, threw them down onto a table, and complained that they hurt his ears. This created an immediate problem, because the director, working from the other side of the glass, now had no way to speak to the star sealed inside the booth. Cartwright realized she would have to step in and guide the legendary actor herself. Douglas then informed the crew that he would give them 2 takes and no more, after which he intended to leave. The trouble was that he kept getting a line wrong. Take after take, he stumbled over the same word, and with his self-imposed limit of 2 attempts hanging over the session, the crew grew desperate. Cartwright, needing one more chance at the line, resorted to a small, clever trick. As Douglas finished a take, she let out an enormous fake sneeze, then apologized for having ruined the recording, framing the spoiled take as her own fault rather than his. Douglas, unbothered, agreed easily to go again, never realizing that the sneeze had been a performance designed to win another attempt out of him. While this little game played out, the director was left, by Cartwright's description, picking his jaw up off the floor at the audacity of it. None of this was entirely surprising to those who knew the man's reputation. Kirk Douglas had long been considered difficult to work with. A famous co-star of his had bluntly described him as difficult, and his battles with one legendary director had reportedly grown so bitter that the 2 men had to attend counseling sessions together just to finish their film. He was a titan of the screen, and he carried himself like one, and the small comic chore of voicing a cartoon character was clearly beneath the level of effort he felt it deserved. The finished episode betrays none of this. The performance works, but behind the smooth result was a star who could not be bothered, an impatient legend with a limousine idling outside, and a crew quietly scrambling to coax a usable take out of him before he walked. If Kirk Douglas was the difficult guest, another famous visitor was the reluctant one, and his story is gentler but no less revealing. George Harrison, one of the 4 members of the most famous band in history, came to the show in the early 90s to voice himself in an episode about a barbershop quartet, a loving parody of his own old group. He was the second member of that band to appear on the show, following an earlier visit from the band's drummer. The cameo itself is small and charming. Homer, at an awards ceremony, meets the great musician, but rather than being starstruck by the legend in front of him, Homer fixates entirely on the brownie the man is holding and rushes off to find more, leaving Harrison to remark mildly on what a nice fellow Homer seems to be. The reality of his visit, as the show's creator later recalled it, carried a melancholy edge. Harrison arrived at the recording studio in West Los Angeles entirely alone, with no entourage and no bodyguards. A quiet man stepping in to do a small job. The appearance was meant to be kept secret, though the show's creator, unaware of the secrecy, excitedly announced to the whole writer's room afterward that he had just met the famous musician. What stuck with the staff was the mood of the man. By the creator's recollection, Harrison seemed pretty glum throughout, and when the writers, thrilled to be in his presence, peppered him with eager questions about his old band, he answered without enthusiasm, plainly uninterested in revisiting that part of his life. He was polite, he did the work, and he left, but he carried none of the joy that the people around him felt at meeting him. The contrast with the band's drummer, who had visited the show a few seasons earlier, is striking. That earlier guest had been given a warm and generous portrayal, shown as a kind soul who personally answered every piece of fan mail he received, including decades-old letters. A depiction full of affection. The reluctant guest, by contrast, gave the show a glum afternoon and a brief, weary cameo. 2 members of the same legendary band, 2 completely different experiences in the booth. One warm and willing, the other distant and tired. The finished cartoon smoothed both into the same cheerful style, but the human truth behind each was its own small story. The third and saddest tale from behind the microphone is not about a famous guest at all, but about a member of the show's own extended family, a voice actress whose departure changed Springfield forever. Her name is Maggie Roswell, and for years she gave voice to a number of recurring characters in the town, including the gentle, devout wife of the family's neighbor. She had been with the show since its earliest days, a quiet but essential presence woven through countless episodes. The trouble began with geography. In the mid-90s, Roswell and her husband moved away from Los Angeles to Denver, a city far from the studio where the show was recorded. From that point on, she had to fly back and forth between the 2 cities twice a week to record her lines. The travel was exhausting and expensive. expensive, and as the years passed, it became increasingly hard to justify. By the end of the decade, she asked the network for a raise, requesting that her pay per episode be lifted to a level that would help cover the considerable cost of all that flying. The amount she was asking for was modest by the standards of the show, far less than the lead performers earned, and intended mainly to recoup her travel expenses rather than to enrich her. The network's response was almost insultingly small. Rather than meeting her request, they offered her a token increase, an extra sum so tiny that it barely registered against the cost of her flights. Faced with that offer, Roswell decided she could no longer continue, and she left the show. And here is where the off-screen dispute reached directly into the world of the cartoon. With the voice of the neighbor's wife suddenly gone, the writers chose to solve the problem in the most permanent way available to them. They killed the character off. Her death came in an early episode of the 11th season, and it was deliberately absurd, the kind of darkly comic demise the show specialized in. While the family attended a stock car race, the gentle wife was struck by a barrage of promotional shirts fired from cannons into the crowd. The volley aimed at Homer, who ducked at the last moment so that the shirts hit her instead, knocking her from the grandstand to her death. A beloved supporting character, a fixture of the town for a decade, was erased from the show in a freak accident involving t-shirt cannons, and the real reason behind it had nothing to do with story. She died because of a dispute over the cost of a plane ticket. The death proved to be one of the rare permanent ones in the show's history, and it left a lasting mark. The widowed neighbor was changed by the loss, his character darkening and shifting in ways that fans noticed for years afterward. Even people who worked on the show came to regret the decision. When a critic later described the killing of the character as a sin, one of the show's own veteran producers agreed with the harsh assessment. The voice actress herself eventually returned to the show a couple of years later, after a new arrangement allowed her to record her lines from Denver rather than flying out, and she resumed voicing her other characters. But the gentle wife stayed dead. The character could not be brought back because the show had already written her permanent end into its history during the brief window when her voice was gone. These three stories, taken together, reveal the unglamorous machinery behind the famous cameos and beloved voices. A legendary actor who treated the work as a tedious chore, idling his limousine and rationing his takes. A legendary musician who showed up alone and weary, plainly wishing to be elsewhere. And a loyal voice actress driven out by a stingy refusal over travel money, her character sacrificed to solve a budget dispute. None of this appears in the finished episodes. The cartoon presents only the smooth, cheerful surface, the perfect performances, the seamless world. The truth lived in the booth and in the negotiations, in the human friction that the polish concealed. There is a fitting symmetry in closing the first half of this long night here behind the microphone, because it returns to the theme that began with the vanished Michael Jackson episode. The trouble with building a show out of famous people, and out of the people who voice it, is that those people are human, fallible, sometimes difficult, sometimes unwilling, sometimes simply too expensive to keep. The cameos that ended badly, the recordings that turned sour, the character killed over a plane ticket, all of them spring from the same root. A cartoon may be drawn and frozen and perfect, but it is made by living people, and living people bring their pride and their weariness and their disputes into the room with them. And yet, for all that human trouble, the cartoon world itself remains strangely untouched by time. The actors age, the guests fall from grace, the voices come and go, but Springfield stays exactly as it always was. Bart never grows up, Maggie never speaks. The town never changes its address, and its people never grow a day older across more than 3 decades on the air. That permanence, that refusal of the cartoon world to obey the ordinary rules of time, is its own deep and quiet mystery, and it is where the second half of this night begins. The troubles behind the microphone belong to the real world. What waits ahead belongs entirely to the strange and unaging world inside the screen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the fifth story closes the first half behind the microphone, with a difficult legend, a weary musician, and a loyal voice lost to a quarrel over a plane ticket. From the human troubles that shaped the show, we now cross into the stranger territory of the cartoon world itself. Next, we sit with the unsettling fact that this family has never aged a single day. Section 6. The family that never grows older. Time is the one thing nothing in the real world can escape. Children grow tall and then grow old. Parents fade and pass. The seasons turn, the calendar advances, and every living thing is carried forward whether it wishes to be or not. We measure our lives by this motion, by birthdays and anniversaries and the slow accumulation of years on a face. To imagine a life without that forward motion, a life held perfectly still while the world around it keeps changing, is to imagine something quietly unnatural. And yet that is exactly the condition of the family at the center of Springfield. For more than 3 decades they have lived without aging a single day, and the longer one sits with that fact, the stranger and more unsettling it becomes. Consider the children. The boy has been 10 years old for the entire life of the show. The girl has been 8 for just as long. The baby has been a baby, silent and watchful, clutching her pacifier for over 30 years, never growing, never walking off into childhood, never speaking more than a stray word or two in all that time. The parents too remain frozen, the father somewhere in his late 30s, the mother a little younger, neither of them ever drifting toward old age. The whole household is suspended at a single moment of life, caught and held while the calendar refuses to release them. What makes this stranger still is that the world around them does not stand still at all. Springfield is always set in the present day, whatever the present day happens to be. The technology updates, the references shift. The family that once lived in a world of bulky television sets and paper maps now lives in a world of glowing handheld screens and voices in the air, and they have made that journey without anyone growing a day older. They have witnessed the arrival of one new wonder after another, decade upon decade of change, and through all of it, the boy has stayed 10 and the baby has stayed a baby. They are not frozen in a particular year. They are frozen in age, while time pours endlessly around them, always living in a present that keeps moving forward without them. A world like that runs into trouble the moment it tries to remember its own past. If the children never age, but the present keeps advancing, then the family's history can never sit still. Their own beginnings must keep sliding forward to stay just behind the unchanging now, and the result is a past that quietly rewrites itself, contradicting what it said before. The show has told its audience 2 completely different stories about when this family came to be, and the 2 stories cannot both be true. In the early years, the show was generous with the details of how the parents met and fell in love. It took the audience back to a specific time, to the year 1974, and showed the 2 of them as teenagers in high school. The future father, a clumsy boy chasing the future mother through the halls of Springfield High. The romance was rooted firmly in that decade, in its fashions and its music and its mood. The births of the children were anchored just as precisely. The boy's conception was tied to the release of a famous space adventure film that everyone can date to 1980. The girl's arrival was bound up with a great athletic competition held in the city of Los Angeles in 1984. The youngest child came a few years after that. For a while, the family had a clear and dateable history. The parents were children of the 70s, the kids were born in the 80s, and the math held together. But the show kept going, year after year, decade after decade, and the children stubbornly refused to age. A boy born in 1980 cannot still be 10 years old 30 years later. The original history, so neatly dated, became impossible, and so the past quietly moved. A much later episode revisited the parents' youth and placed it in an entirely different decade, showing their courtship not in the 70s but in the 1990s. The mother, now a college student of that era, the father, now the singer in a band drenched in the sound of that very different time. The same 2 people, the same love story, relocated wholesale to a later decade to keep pace with a present that would not stop advancing. These 2 accounts simply cannot be reconciled. A couple cannot have fallen in love as teenagers in the 1970s and also as young adults in the 1990s. A child cannot have been conceived in 1980 and also be born to parents who only met in the 90s. The family's own history contradicts itself, and the contradiction is not a small slip in a single scene. It is a fundamental instability in the very foundation of who these people are. Their past is a moving target, sliding forward through the decades to remain forever just out of reach behind the present, dissolving and reforming as the years demand. Sit with that for a moment, slowly, the way the late hour invites. These are people without a fixed origin. Ask when the parents met and the world gives 2 answers, and there is no way to choose between them, because the world itself does not know. Ask when the children were born and the same instability appears, the dates quietly abandoned and replaced as needed. A real person carries their history as a settled thing, a single unchangeable line stretching back to a particular day in a particular year. This family carries no such line. Their beginning is wherever the present needs it to be, and it changes whenever the present moves on. The eerie heart of all this is the children, frozen at the threshold of growing up and never permitted to cross it. The boy will be 10 forever. He will never become a teenager, never grow into a man, never leave the 4th grade that has held him for over 30 years. The girl will be 8 forever, brilliant and lonely and 8, year after year after year, her gifts never ripening into the adulthood they so clearly point toward. And the baby is perhaps the most haunting of all. She has sat silent in her high chair for more than 3 decades, watching everything, understanding far more than a baby should, and yet she never grows, never walks walks into her own life, never speaks the words she so plainly seems ready to say. To be a baby for 30 years is to be trapped at the very beginning of a life that will never be allowed to unfold. There is a gentle horror in this when one looks at it directly, the kind of horror that hides inside something familiar and comforting. The family is happy enough in their way. They love each other, they squabble and reconcile, they live their endless, cheerful lives. But they are also caught outside of time, neither moving forward nor falling away, denied the ordinary mercy of growth and the ordinary sorrow of aging alike. The children will never know what they would have become. The parents will never grow old together. The baby will never speak her first real sentence. They are held in a single moment of family life, repeated and repeated, while the rest of the world ages and changes and moves on without them, leaving them behind in a present that is always now and never tomorrow. The future is just as unstable as the past, which only deepens the strangeness. The show has, on several occasions, lifted the curtain and shown what is supposedly to come for this family. Glimpses of the children grown, married, settled into adult lives. But these visions of the future contradict one another just as badly as the visions of the past. One glimpse shows the girl marrying one sort of man at one point in the coming years. Another glimpse, made later, shows an entirely different future, with different partners, different fates, different versions of who these children will become. The futures cannot all be real, because the present keeps sliding forward beneath them, dragging the supposed future along with it and rewriting it each time. The family's tomorrow is as much a moving target as their yesterday. They have no settled past and no settled future, only the endless, unchanging present, with both ends of their lives forever dissolving and reforming around them. This is the deep and quiet mystery of the floating timeline, and unlike many mysteries, it has no solution, because it is built into the very nature of the world. The family cannot age, because the show depends on them staying as they are. The present cannot stop moving, because the world insists on remaining current, and so the history and the future must endlessly slide to accommodate both demands, leaving the family suspended in a single moment that stretches across the decades. There is no episode that will ever fix this, no revelation that will set the timeline straight, because the floating is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the condition the family lives in. They are people made of an eternal present, and that present has no edges. The implication, when followed all the way down, is genuinely unsettling. Somewhere in this fictional town, there is a family that has lived the same span of life for over 30 years, watching the world transform around them while they themselves remain exactly as they were. The boy plays the same pranks at the same age. The girl plays the same instrument with the same lonely brilliance. The baby watches from the same high chair, silent, unchanging, eternal. They are not ghosts exactly, for ghosts at least belong to a past. They are something stranger, a family that exists wholly inside a single moment, untouched by the time that destroys everything else, and unable to escape that moment no matter how long the years pile up around them. To think about it for too long is to feel a kind of vertigo, a soft dizziness at the idea of a life with no forward motion at all. We are so accustomed to time carrying us along that the absence of it feels almost impossible to grasp. And yet there it is, playing out night after night, a family held perfectly still at the center of a world that never stops moving. They will be exactly the same tomorrow as they are tonight, and the same a decade from now, and the same long after everyone watching has aged and changed and moved on. The world will keep updating around them, new wonders arriving and old ones fading, and the boy will still be 10, and the baby will still be a baby, and the past behind them will still be dissolving and rewriting itself forever. There is one more layer to the strangeness, and it points toward where this second half of the night will travel next. A family unstuck in time is a peculiar enough thing, but this family is also, in a sense, unstuck in space. Just as the show refuses to fix the family in any single moment of history, it refuses to fix their town in any single place on the map. For all the decades that Springfield has existed, for all the thousands of small details the show has revealed about it, one basic fact has been deliberately and carefully withheld. No one knows what state Springfield is in. The town that holds this ageless family has no fixed location at all, hidden on purpose. Its true place on the map turned into a riddle that the show has spent its entire life refusing to answer. The family floats in time. The town, it turns out, floats in space. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the sixth piece of the puzzle is a family suspended outside of time, their childhoods frozen forever, and their very history quietly rewriting itself behind them. From a family unstuck in time, we now turn to a town unstuck in space. Next, we go searching for the state that Springfield has spent its whole life hiding. Section 7. The town with no state. There is a deep human comfort in knowing where a place is. A town sits in a county, the county in a state, the state in a country, each nested inside the next like rooms within a house. And that nesting gives a place its solidity. Pin a town to a map and it becomes real, locatable, a spot a person could drive to. Home, above all, is a place with an address. We carry the location of the places we love inside us, certain of where they sit beneath the sky. To imagine a town that cannot be found, a place with no fixed spot on any map, is to imagine something quietly wrong, a home that floats free of the ground itself. Springfield is exactly such a place. For the entire life of the show, the most basic fact about this town has been withheld, hidden on purpose, guarded so carefully that it has become one of the longest running mysteries in television. No one knows what state Springfield is in. This absence is stranger than it first appears, because the show has told its audience an enormous amount about the town. The streets are named, the businesses are mapped, the neighborhoods are familiar, the local landmarks have been visited hundreds of times. A person could draw the layout of Springfield from memory, could name the school and the tavern and the nuclear plant and the quiet street where the family lives, and yet for all that intimate knowledge, the single fact that would anchor the whole town to the real world has been kept secret. The audience knows the inside of Springfield perfectly and has no idea where it sits. What makes the secret remarkable is that it is not a matter of mere omission. The show does not simply forget to mention the state, it actively conceals it again and again with a kind of mischievous determination. Whenever a character seems about to reveal the location, something interrupts them. A noise drowns out the crucial word. A sentence trails off at the exact moment the state name would arrive. A sign or a map appears on screen only to be blocked, blurred, or turned away at the last possible second. The concealment is deliberate and constant, a game the show plays with its audience, dangling the answer and then snatching it away every single time. The town is not accidentally unlocated. It is being hidden, on purpose, by a series that finds the hiding funnier than any answer could ever be. When the show does drop clues, they contradict one another so thoroughly that they cancel out. Over the decades, Springfield has been described in ways that place it in wildly different parts of the country. Its climate and its geography and its neighbors shifting from one episode to the next. At one moment, the town seems to sit in one region of the nation. At another, it seems to sit somewhere entirely different. The most famous of these contradictions came in a single visual joke that named the 4 states supposedly bordering Springfield, and the 4 states named cannot possibly all touch a single place, scattered as they are across the map in directions that make any real location impossible. The joke was the point. The clues are not meant to be assembled into an answer. They are meant to make the answer unreachable, each new hint colliding with the last until the whole picture dissolves into static. Even the small administrative details refuse to agree. The telephone codes that have appeared for the town point to different and distant parts of the country, one suggesting one region and another suggesting somewhere thousands of miles away. There is no consistent thread to follow, no quiet pattern hiding beneath the contradictions for a careful detective to uncover. Every path leads somewhere different, and every somewhere is contradicted by the next clue down the line. The strangest detail of all concerns a moment when the show very nearly gave a definite answer, and then deliberately refused to settle on one. In an episode that purported to tell the true history of the family, the narrator described them as belonging to a particular state, but the show prepared several different versions of that line, each naming a different state, with the intention that the answer would change from one airing to the next. The town's home state was meant to be a shifting thing, one region tonight and another region the next time the episode played, the location flickering and changing rather than holding still. A town with not one secret location, but a whole set of contradictory ones, rotating through different states as though the place could not decide where it belonged, or as though it belonged to all of them and none of them at once. The show has even acknowledged the mystery directly, in its own playful way, in a line that captures the whole spirit of the thing. On the classroom chalkboard where the boy is so often made to write out punishments, he once wrote over and over that the true location of Springfield lies in every state except the one where the person watching happens to live. It is a perfect joke because it makes the town both universal and unreachable in the same breath. Springfield is everywhere, it says, in every state across the nation, except the one place the viewer could actually go to look for it. Wherever a person stands, the town is somewhere else. It is always just over the horizon, in the next state over, never in reach. There is a reason the show chose to make the town this way, and it points toward a gentler reading of the mystery. The name Springfield was chosen precisely because because it is one of the most common town names in the entire country. There are Springfields scattered across dozens of states, ordinary places with the same ordinary name, and the idea was that this Springfield could be any of them, that everyone watching could imagine the show taking place in their own nearby Springfield. The town was meant to feel like anywhere, like a kind of universal American small town that belonged to everyone equally, and in trying to make it belong to everyone, the show made it belong to no one in particular. A place that is meant to be anywhere ends up being nowhere specific, a home with 1,000 possible addresses and no real one. That ambition, pushed across more than 3 decades, has produced something that drifts past charming and into the genuinely uncanny. A town meant to feel like anywhere has become a town that exists everywhere and nowhere at once, unanchored, unlocatable, floating free of the map. Some who have studied the clues have proposed that the answer is a state that does not exist at all, a phantom region invented for the show, pointing to certain abbreviations that appear on signs and plates within the town, letters that match no real state in the country, a made-up state for a town that cannot be placed in a real one. It is a fitting theory, even if it has never been confirmed, because it captures the essential truth. The home of this family may not sit in any real place at all. It may exist only in a fictional pocket of the map, a town in a state that was never part of the nation to begin with. The mystery extends beyond Springfield itself to its great rival, the neighboring town that the family loves to hate. That town too has no fixed location, no settled place on the map. The two towns sit beside each other in an empty geography, defined only by their rivalry and never by their position. Two unlocatable places orbiting one another in a void. There is no real spot where they could both exist. No map on which a person could trace the road from one to the other and arrive at a real destination. They are neighbors in a nowhere, joined to each other but joined to nothing else. Sit with the full strangeness of it in the quiet of the late hour. There is a town that has been visited thousands of times, whose every street feels familiar, whose people are known and loved by millions, and that town cannot be found. It has no address. It cannot be driven to. It sits in no state, borders impossible neighbors, gives contradictory clues, and actively hides its own location whenever anyone draws near the answer. The most familiar town in the world is also the most unlocatable. A person could know everything about Springfield except the one thing that would let them stand in it. This is the second great floating of the show, sitting alongside the first. The family floats in time, frozen at a single age while the years pour past them. The town floats in space, fixed to no point on the earth, while every clue about its location contradicts the last. Together they form a world that has come loose from the two anchors that hold ordinary reality in place, the anchor of time and the anchor of geography. The Simpsons live in an eternal present, in a town that exists in no real place, a family with no settled past dwelling in a home with no findable location. The more one looks at it, the more the cheerful, familiar world reveals itself to be built on a strange and dreamlike foundation, untethered from the rules that bind everything else. And there is a comfort hidden inside the strangeness, the kind of soft comfort suited to the late hour. A town that exists everywhere belongs to everyone. The very thing that makes Springfield impossible to locate is the thing that lets every viewer, in every corner of the country, imagine it just down the road from their own home. The mystery is not cold, it is generous. The town hides its location so that it can be everyone's town, so that no one is excluded from claiming it. A place that floats free of the map is a place that can settle, gently, anywhere a person wishes to imagine it, in the warm and shapeless geography of memory, rather than on any cold and definite chart. Still, the unease lingers underneath the comfort, the quiet vertigo of a home that cannot be found. And it deepens further when the gaze turns from the town to the people who live in it. Because if Springfield itself has no fixed place, then perhaps it should come as no surprise that one of its most familiar residents turned out to have no fixed identity either. There was a moment in the long life of the show when a character the audience had known and trusted for years, a stern and respectable man at the heart of the town, was suddenly revealed to be someone else entirely, an imposter wearing a borrowed name and a borrowed life. The town had no settled location. As the next part of the night will show, one of its most settled citizens had no settled self. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the seventh piece is a town that hides its own place on the map, contradicting every clue and belonging to everywhere and nowhere at once. From a home with no findable location, we now turn to a familiar face with no real identity. Next, we uncover the principal who was secretly never who he claimed to be. Section 8. The principal who was never real. A name is one of the first things we trust about a person. It is the handle by which we hold them, the label under which we file away everything we know about who they are. When someone tells us their name, we rarely question it. We take it as the bedrock fact, the thing on which all the other facts rest. And because of that, there is a special kind of unease in the idea that a familiar person, someone known and trusted for years, might be living under a name that was never truly theirs, that the face we recognize might belong to a stranger, that the whole identity might be a performance, a borrowed life worn so long that no one ever thought to doubt it. The Simpsons once told exactly this story, about one of the most settled and respectable figures in the entire town, and the strangeness of what it revealed has never quite been resolved. The man in question is the principal of the local elementary school, a stern, rule-loving, faintly pitiable figure who had been part of the show since its earliest days. He was the kind of character whose entire personality seemed fixed and known, a starched and rigid authority figure, devoted to order, dominated by his overbearing mother, forever locked in his small battles with the troublemaking boy who made his life difficult. For years, the audience watched him, learned his habits, came to understand him as one of the steady fixtures of Springfield. He was, if anything, one of the least mysterious people in town, a man whose dullness was the whole point of him. The unraveling came during what should have been a moment of honor. The town gathered to celebrate his 20th anniversary as principal, a banquet thrown to mark 2 decades of faithful service. The celebration was proceeding warmly when a stranger walked in, a weathered man who made an impossible claim. He announced that he was the real Seymour Skinner, the true bearer of the name, and that the man being honored was a fraud who had stolen his identity. The room turned to the principal, expecting an outraged denial. Instead, after a long pause, the principal confessed. The name he had carried for 20 years did not belong to him. He had been born under another name entirely. His true name was Armin Tamzarian, and the identity of Seymour Skinner was one he had quietly taken from another man. The story he told to explain himself was strange and oddly moving. He had been, in his youth, a troubled orphan from the city, a directionless young delinquent who joined the army to escape a jail sentence. In the service, during a distant war, he came under the command of a sergeant named Seymour Skinner, a decent and inspiring man who became his mentor and gave his aimless life a sense of purpose. The sergeant spoke often of his dream of returning home one day to become a school principal. Then the sergeant was reported missing in action and presumed dead. The young orphan traveled to the sergeant's hometown to deliver the terrible news to the man's mother. But when he arrived, the grieving old woman looked at him and mistook him for her own son, and rather than break her heart with the truth, he allowed the mistake to stand. He stepped into the dead man's name, the dead man's home, and the dead man's dream, becoming the principal his mentor had always wished to be, and living that borrowed life so completely that everyone, including himself, came to accept it as real. The twist, of course, is that the real Seymour Skinner had not died at all. He had survived, endured years of captivity and hardship, and finally made his way home, only to discover another man wearing his name and living his life. The rightful owner of the identity had returned to reclaim it, and the town now faced an impossible question. 2 men, 1 name. Which of them was the real Seymour Skinner? The one born to it, who had been gone for decades and was a stranger to everyone? Or the imposter who had lived the name faithfully for 20 years and become, in every practical sense, the man the town knew and depended upon? What the town decided is the part of the story that lingers most uneasily. Faced with a genuine article, the people of Springfield found him unfamiliar and unlikable, a stranger who had upended their comfortable world. They missed the man they had known, the imposter, the borrowed Skinner who had run their school and lived among them for 20 years. And so they made a collective choice. They rejected the real Seymour Skinner, drove him out of town, and decreed that the imposter would, from that day forward, simply be the real Seymour Skinner. The town chose the comfortable lie over the disruptive truth, and enforced that choice on everyone. The way they enforced it is the detail that turns the story from strange to genuinely unsettling. A local judge issued a formal order. The matter was never to be spoken of again. The whole affair, the confession, the imposter, the true name of Armin Tamzarian, the existence of the real Skinner, all of it was to be erased from conversation, forbidden by decree, never mentioned by anyone ever again. The town did not merely choose to forget, it legislated its own forgetting, made the truth illegal to utter, sealed the secret behind an official command of silence. A man's entire real identity was buried by order of the court, and the borrowed self was installed in its place, as though it had always been the truth. There is something deeply uncanny in that enforced amnesia, a small dystopia hiding inside a comedy. An entire community agreed to unknow something they all knew, to look at a man every day and call him by a name they understood to be false, to maintain a fiction together out of nothing more than a preference for the familiar. The truth did not change. The man was still, underneath it all, the orphan named Armin Tamzarian, Tamzarian, who had stepped into a dead man's life. The town simply decided, collectively and by force of law, that this truth would no longer be allowed to exist. They chose the mask over the face beneath it, and then forbade anyone from ever again acknowledging that there was a face beneath it at all. And here the story takes its final and strangest turn, because the forgetting did not stop with the town inside the episode. The show itself seemed to take the decree to heart. After this revelation aired, the matter was almost never raised again. The events were acknowledged only a tiny handful of times, once or twice in passing, treated as a kind of embarrassing aberration. And as the years went on, the show began to tell stories that quietly contradicted the whole revelation, restoring the principal's old, ordinary history, as though the confession had never happened. Later episodes showed him as a child, growing up with the very mother he was supposedly not related to, depicted his birth, his boyhood, his teenage years living at home, an entire normal past that could not possibly be true if he were really the orphan named Armin Tamzarian who had stolen the identity as a grown man. The canon swallowed its own revelation. The show untold the story it had told, burying the imposter beneath a restored fiction of a normal life. This leaves the character in a genuinely strange condition, suspended between two contradictory truths that the show has never reconciled. There exists, somewhere in the history of the series, a definite and stated revelation that the principal is an imposter named Armin Tamzarian who took a dead man's life. And there also exists a body of later stories insisting that he is, and always was, the genuine Seymour Skinner, born and raised in the town as the son of his own mother. Both versions are part of the show. Neither has ever been cleanly cancelled. The man is, at once, the imposter he was revealed to be, and the authentic figure the show later restored him to being. His identity floats, unresolved, caught between a buried truth and an enforced fiction. Sit with that in the quiet, the way the late hour allows. Every time the principal appears now, going about his small, rigid life, there is a discarded truth lurking somewhere beneath him, a revelation the town forbade and the show abandoned, a name he was given and then had taken away again. He is a man living a borrowed life that everyone, including the story he lives in, has agreed to call real. The truth about him was spoken once, clearly and completely, and then it was sealed away, contradicted, and left to molder in the basement of the canon, neither alive nor entirely dead. He carries, invisibly, the ghost of the orphan he was revealed to be, a self that exists and does not exist at the same time. The deepest unease in the story is how easily it all happened. A man wore a false identity for 20 years and became that identity so thoroughly that the truth, when it finally arrived, felt less real than the lie. A town decided that the comfortable falsehood was preferable to the disruptive fact and simply legislated reality to match their preference. And the show itself, faced with a revelation it had made, chose to bury it and pretend otherwise, restoring the old, comfortable version as though the truth could be unspoken back into non-existence. At every level, from the man to the town to the story itself, the same choice was made. The truth was known, and then it was deliberately unknown, set aside in favor of the version everyone preferred to believe. It joins the larger pattern that this second half of the night keeps uncovering. The family floats in time, frozen and rewritten. The town floats in space, unlocatable and contradicted. And now identity itself floats, a man both an imposter and not, his real name buried by decree and by the show's own quiet refusal to remember it. The world of Springfield grows less solid the closer one looks at it. Time will not hold still, place will not stay fixed, and even the basic question of who a person is can be answered one way and then unanswered, the truth spoken and then forbidden, established and then erased. There is one more form this instability takes, and it is perhaps the most haunting of all. If a familiar man could be revealed as someone who was never really there, then consider the opposite case. Consider the people who were there, plainly and unmistakably, woven into the fabric of the town for years, and who then simply ceased to exist. Characters who appeared again and again, who had names and faces and histories, and who one day vanished from Springfield without a word of explanation, never mentioned again, quietly erased as though they had never lived at all. The principal had a truth that was buried. As the next part of the night will show, an entire group of townsfolk had something stranger happen to them. They were there, and then they were gone, and the town went on as if it had never known them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the eighth piece is a familiar man revealed as a stranger, an imposter whose true name the town buried by law and the show buried by silence. From a self that was quietly erased, we now turn to the people who were erased entirely. Next, we go looking for the townsfolk who vanished from Springfield and were never spoken of again. Section 9. The townsfolk who disappeared. People slip out of our lives more quietly than we expect. A neighbor moves away. A familiar face at a shop is replaced by a stranger. An old acquaintance simply stops appearing, and often there is no announcement, no farewell, just a gradual realization that someone who used to be present is present no longer. The space they occupied closes over, smooth and seamless, until it is hard to remember they were ever there at all. Towns absorb these absences without noticing them. Life goes on, the streets stay busy, and the missing are quietly forgotten. Springfield, for all its cheerful permanence, is a town that loses people in exactly this way, and once a person starts to notice the pattern, it becomes one of the more haunting things about the place. Over the long decades, a remarkable number of its residents have simply vanished, never mentioned again, erased so completely that the town carries on as though they had never existed. The strangest of these vanishings belongs to a man who was, for the early years of the show, a familiar and recurring presence, a local psychiatrist who turned up whenever someone in town needed their mind examined. He was a fixture, a known quantity, the sort of character the audience expected to see again and again, and then he was gone. He stopped appearing, quietly and without explanation, fading out of the town's life the way a minor acquaintance fades out of ours. For a long while, his absence went unremarked, until the show acknowledged it in a deeply unsettling way. A building appeared in Springfield bearing his name, a memorial structure, the kind of thing a community erects to honor someone who has died. The implication was clear. The man had passed away, and the town had named a place in his memory, except he had not passed away at all. Years later, long after the memorial had marked his apparent death, the psychiatrist simply reappeared, alive and well, going about his business as though nothing had happened. When his sudden return was noticed, the only explanation he offered was vague and almost dismissive. He had been very sick, he said, and that was all. A man honored with a memorial for the dead turned out to be merely unwell, and then quietly recovered, leaving the town in the strange position of having mourned someone who never died. His status was never properly resolved. He existed in a kind of limbo, dead enough to have a building named in his memory, alive enough to walk back into town years later. The show never explained the contradiction. It simply let it stand. A man who was both gone and not gone, memorialized and breathing at the same time. He is far from the only one. There were two characters in particular, beloved fixtures of the town for years, whose disappearance is perhaps the most complete and the most haunting of all. One was a hopelessly incompetent lawyer, a cheerful con man in a cheap suit who handled the town's legal troubles with spectacular ineptitude. A figure so popular that he appeared again and again across many seasons. The other was a washed-up actor, a vain and faded star, forever turning up in low-budget educational films and infomercials. His name a running joke, his presence a reliable delight. Both men were woven deep into the fabric of Springfield. They felt permanent. They felt like the kind of characters who would always be there, and then they were not. At a certain point, both of them simply stopped appearing. No story explained their departure. No character remarked on their absence. They were not killed, not written out, not given any farewell at all. They were everywhere, and then they were nowhere, and the town went on exactly as before, as if these two prominent men had never lived among them. To this day, they are essentially never seen and never mentioned. Two large and beloved presences that evaporated from the town without leaving so much as a ripple. The seamlessness of it is the eerie part. A real town that lost two such well-known figures would talk about it, would wonder, would mourn. Springfield did not. It closed over the gap instantly and completely, as though the two men had been erased not only from the present, but from the town's very memory of itself. The vanishing reaches even into the family at the center of the show. Homer has a half-brother, a man he discovered later in life, a wealthy and ambitious figure who entered the family story with great fanfare, became genuinely important to them, and then disappeared just as thoroughly as any stranger. After a couple of memorable appearances, this blood relative simply dropped out of the show entirely. Never visited, never called, never mentioned again. The family that supposedly cared about him carried on without the slightest acknowledgement that he existed. If even a brother can vanish from the family's life without a trace, then no one in Springfield is safe from the quiet erasure. The town loses neighbors, it loses public figures, and it loses kin, all with the same effortless forgetting. There are smaller cases too. People who loomed enormously in a single story and then evaporated. There was the smooth-talking bowling instructor who, in the show's very first season, nearly drew Marge into an affair, a figure of real romantic danger who threatened the stability of the entire family. His arrival was a serious matter, a genuine crisis, and once that story ended, he was gone, never seen again. His near destruction of the family's marriage simply absorbed and forgotten. A man who came close to changing everything left no lasting mark on the town at all. He appeared, he mattered intensely for 20 minutes, and then he ceased to be, swallowed by the same void that takes everyone else. Even those who definitively died do not always stay in the town's memory. There was a man who arrived as a kind of grim mirror to Homer, a hard-working and bitter figure who could not bear the ease and luck of Homer's charmed life, and who met a sudden and shocking end within the span of a single story, electrocuted in a fit of rage. He died, plainly and permanently, and the town moved on almost immediately, his death treated as little more than a dark punchline. The only echo he left came much later, when a young man claiming to be his son turned up seeking revenge, a small ripple emerging briefly from the void before sinking back into it. A man lived, raged, died, and was forgotten, leaving behind only a faint and temporary disturbance in the smooth surface of the town's forgetting. The impermanence touches even the smallest members of the household. The family's pets, the cats in particular, have a quiet habit of dying and being replaced, one after another, the new animal stepping into the old one's place with barely a pause for grief. A pet passes, another arrives, the name carries on, and the family hardly seems to notice the substitution. It is a domestic echo of the larger pattern, a small reminder that in this world, individuals are interchangeable and impermanent, that the space left by the departed is filled so quickly and so smoothly that the loss barely registers. Even within the four walls of the family home, beings come and go and are quietly forgotten. Sit with the full weight of this in the late quiet, and a strange picture emerges. Springfield is a town built, in part, on vanished people. Beneath its cheerful surface lies a long roster of the forgotten, residents who were present and then absent, beloved and then erased, mourned with a memorial and then found alive, woven into family and then dropped without a word. The town does not hold on to its people. They slip out of existence and the world closes seamlessly over the gap, and no one marks the loss. It is as if the place has no real memory of its own inhabitants, as if people can simply cease to be and the town will not register their going. There is something genuinely uncanny in a community that loses its members so easily and so completely. We like to believe that a person who lived among others leaves a lasting impression, that their absence would be felt, that someone would notice and wonder and remember. Springfield offers the opposite comfort, or the opposite discomfort. People vanish and the town does not feel it. The lawyer and the actor disappear, and no one asks where they went. The half-brother stops visiting, and the family does not call. The psychiatrist is memorialized and then resurrected, and no one demands an explanation. To live in such a place would be to know, somewhere deep down, that one's own disappearance would be just as quiet, just as unremarked, just as easily absorbed. This is the fourth great instability of the world the show has built, and perhaps the most personal of them all. The family floats in time, never aging while the years pour past. The town floats in space, fixed to no point on the map. Identity floats, a familiar man both an imposter and not. And now existence itself floats, the very personhood of the town's residents revealed to be impermanent, provisional, easily erased. People here are not fixed points. They are temporary presences, here for a while and then gone, slipping out of being while the world carries on without them. The canon does not keep its own inhabitants. It loses them, quietly and constantly, and remembers them not at all. And yet, woven through all this forgetting, there runs one final thread that turns the strangeness in an entirely different direction. A town that cannot hold on to its own past, that loses its people and rewrites its history and forgets who came and went, has somehow, again and again, seemed to remember things that had not yet happened. While Springfield forgets its dead and erases its vanished, the show containing it has developed a reputation for the opposite of forgetting, a reputation for knowing. Across its long life, it has shown event after event that would later come true in the real world. Moments that seem to reach forward in time and pluck the future out of the dark before it arrived. The town cannot remember its own people. As the final part of this night will explore, the show somehow keeps remembering tomorrow. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the ninth piece is a town that quietly loses its own people, residents erased without a word, while the world closes seamlessly over the space they left. From a place that forgets its own past, we now turn to the strangest thing of all, a show that somehow keeps remembering the future. Next, we sit with the predictions that came true. Section 10, the show that saw the future. Human beings have always longed to know what is coming. We read the stars, we study the patterns of birds, we turn over cards and tea leaves and dreams, all in the hope of catching some glimpse of tomorrow before it arrives. The future is the one country none of us can visit in advance, and that is exactly why it fascinates us so deeply. A person who could truly see ahead, who could name events before they happened, would seem touched by something close to magic. It is one of the strangest twists in the whole long story of Springfield that this reputation, the reputation of a seer, of a thing that knows the future, came to rest not on a prophet or a mystic, but on a cartoon comedy. Over the decades, the show that contains this ageless family in its unlocatable town town has become famous, above almost everything else, for seeming to predict what was going to happen in the real world. The reputation did not appear all at once. It built slowly, gag by gag, year by year, as eagle-eyed viewers began to notice that moments from old episodes kept matching events in the news. A joke tossed off in passing would suddenly seem to describe something that had just occurred in reality, and people would dig up the old clip and marvel at it. Over time, this became a kind of ongoing game, with fans combing through the show's enormous back catalog in search of the next eerie match, the next moment where the cartoon seemed to have known something it could not possibly have known. The show that forgets its own people, that loses its residents and rewrites its own past, had somehow earned a name as the thing that remembers the future. The most famous of all these moments arrived in an episode from the spring of the year 2000. In that episode, the boy is shown a vision of what lies ahead for his family, and in that vision, his sister has grown up to become the President of the United States. As the newly installed president addresses her staff, she makes a passing remark about the difficult financial situation she has inherited, noting that the country is deep in a budget crisis left behind by the previous administration. And the name she gives for that previous president, the predecessor whose mess she must now clean up, is Donald Trump. The line was a throwaway, a single quick joke buried in a larger story, and at the time it meant very little. It aired a full 16 years before Donald Trump would actually be elected to the presidency. When the moment finally arrived in the real world, that old clip resurfaced and spread everywhere, held up as the most stunning example yet of the show's uncanny foresight. A cartoon had named a future president by name more than a decade and a half before it happened. To many people, it seemed to confirm that the show possessed some genuine and inexplicable gift for seeing ahead. The truth behind that particular prediction is more grounded, and it was explained, eventually, by the very person who wrote the line. According to the writer, the joke was never meant as a prophecy. It was meant as a warning, a piece of satire about where the country seemed to be heading. The episode imagined a future in which America had drifted toward absurdity, and a Trump presidency was offered as the logical last stop on that downward road, the natural endpoint of trends the show had been watching and mocking for years. At the time the joke was written, Trump had already made a brief, fringe attempt at running for high office, so the name was not pulled from nowhere. It was a sharp guess about the direction of things, an extrapolation of the culture taken to its most extreme conclusion. The show was not seeing the future. It was reading the present very carefully and imagining where it might lead. But the explanation, sensible as it is, does not entirely dissolve the strangeness, and the show itself seemed to feel that. Long after the prediction came true, the series slipped in a small acknowledgement, a moment where the boy, at his familiar classroom chalkboard, wrote out a weary line about how being right is not always something to celebrate. The show recognized its own reputation, even seemed a little haunted by it, the sense that its dark, satirical guesses kept turning into reality whether it wanted them to or not. The Trump prediction is the most famous, but it is far from the only one, and some of the others are harder to wave away. In an episode from the late 90s, the show included a brief background gag, a sign identifying the very film studio that produced the show as being a division of a certain enormous entertainment company. At the time, it was pure absurdity, a joke about corporate giants swallowing one another, the kind of exaggeration the show loved. More than 20 years later, that exact merger happened in reality. The studio that made the show was indeed absorbed by that very company, precisely as the throwaway joke had described. A background gag, planted decades earlier as a piece of silliness, had quietly described a real corporate event that no one in the late 90s could reasonably have foreseen. There are others scattered throughout the show's long life, episodes that featured small handheld devices and screens that did things ordinary technology of the time could not yet do, gadgets that would later become commonplace. A storyline involving a fish born with an extra eye, mutated by pollution, an image of environmental decay that has only grown more resonant with time. A moment involving a voting machine that refused to record a vote correctly, which struck uncomfortable chords during later real-world disputes about elections. One by one, these moments accumulated, until the show had built a genuine legend around itself, a reputation as a kind of accidental oracle, forever glimpsing fragments of a future it should have had no way to see. How does one explain it? The grounded answer, the one that holds up under careful thought, is not mystical at all, and it rests on the sheer scale of the thing. This is a show that has produced an astonishing number of episodes across more than 3 decades, each one packed with dozens of jokes, references, background details, and throwaway gags. Many of those jokes reach out and touch the real world, mocking trends, exaggerating possibilities, imagining absurd futures. When a show makes that many guesses about where the culture is heading across that many years, the law of large numbers takes over. Out of tens of thousands of jokes, some are bound to match what actually happens, purely by chance and volume. A prophet method who makes one prediction and gets it right is remarkable. A machine that makes 100,000 predictions will inevitably get some of them right, and those few hits will be remembered while the countless misses are quietly forgotten. And the show's particular way of making jokes makes those hits more likely than pure chance alone would suggest. The series has always specialized in a certain kind of satire, taking a trend in the present and following it to its most absurd logical conclusion. When a writer extrapolates from where things are to where they might end up, and does so with real insight into the culture, the extrapolation will sometimes land on what actually comes to pass. Not because of magic, but because the writer reasoned forward correctly. The Trump joke is the clearest example. The writer looked at the direction of American culture and politics, imagined the most extreme outcome, and named it, and reality eventually caught up to the satire. That is not foresight in the supernatural sense. It is sharp observation, projected forward and occasionally vindicated. Selective memory does the rest of the work. The human mind is drawn to patterns and to coincidence, and it remembers the striking matches while letting the failures slip away. For every gag that came eerily true, there are countless others that described futures which never arrived, predictions that missed entirely, jokes that pointed nowhere. No one collects those. No one makes excited lists of the times the show guessed wrong. The legend of the show as a seer is built entirely on the hits, with the vast field of misses conveniently invisible. The reputation is real, but it is assembled from a carefully filtered selection of the evidence, the successes preserved and the failures discarded. And yet, even with all of that laid out plainly, something stubborn remains. The explanation accounts for the pattern in general, but it struggles with the specifics. The law of large numbers explains why some jokes would come true, but it does not quite explain why the show named a specific future president by name or described a specific corporate merger involving its own studio decades in advance. Those hits are so particular, so precise, that the rational account, however correct, never fully drains away the eerie feeling. The mind hears the explanation, nods along, and then looks at the clip again and feels the small chill return. The mystery is explained without being entirely dissolved, which is perhaps the most unsettling state a mystery can occupy. This is the final strange property of the world that this second half of the night has been slowly uncovering, and it completes a remarkable pattern. The family floats in time, frozen at a single age while the years pour endlessly past them. The town floats in space, fixed to no point on any map, contradicting every clue about its location. Identity floats, a familiar man revealed as an imposter and then quietly restored, his truth buried by decree and by silence. Existence itself floats, the townspeople slipping in and out of being, vanishing without a trace, memorialized and then resurrected. The world of Springfield has come loose from time, from place, from identity, from the very permanence of its inhabitants, and now, at the end, there is this final loosening, the strangest of all. A world so thoroughly unmoored from reality, so detached from the ordinary rules that bind everything else, somehow keeps reaching forward through time to touch the real world's future before it arrives. There is a deep paradox sitting at the center of that. The most unreal town imaginable, a place outside of time and space and certainty, a place that cannot even keep track of who lives in it, is also the place that keeps intersecting most uncannily with what is real and what is coming. The show has spent its entire life detaching itself from reality, refusing to fix its family in time, or its town in space, or its characters in any stable identity. And yet that very detachment seems to have given it a strange freedom to roam across the years and brush against the future. A thing untethered from the present can drift in any direction, including forward, and now and then it returns from those drifts carrying something that turns out to be true. As this long night draws toward its close, it is worth pausing to take in the whole of the journey, gently, the way one looks back over a path already walked. The first half of the night moved through the troubled world of the famous, the cameos that curdled and the recordings that soured. A beloved episode erased from existence because of the man whose voice was hidden inside it. A field of baseball stars frozen forever in silly cartoon fates, while their real lives carried them toward harder ends. Guest spots that swallowed whole episodes and were later disowned by the very show that made them. A movie star flattered in a way that became, by accident, a warning. Difficult legends and weary musicians in the recording booth, and a gentle character lost forever to a quiet dispute. All of it sprang from the same root, the simple fact that a show built out of real and famous people is always at the mercy of those people, and people are fragile, flawed, and forever changing. The second half moves somewhere quieter and stranger, into the properties of the cartoon world itself, the floating time and the unlocatable town, the borrowed identity and the vanished townsfolk and the seen future. These were not troubles brought in from the outside world. They were features of the strange dream that Springfield has always been, a place that never quite obeyed the rules of reality, and that grew only more dreamlike the longer one stared at it. The eerie things in this half were not scandals or mistakes. They were the natural strangeness of a world that has lived too long and too freely to stay bound by the ordinary laws of time and space and memory. Taken together, the two halves describe something genuinely remarkable, a show that is at once deeply unreal and uncannily entangled with reality. On one side, it draws the real world into itself, pulling in famous people and watching their reputations rise and fall within its frames. On the other side, it drifts free of reality entirely, a town outside time and place and certainty. And somehow, in that contradiction, it manages to do both at once, to be the most unreal place imaginable, and also the place that keeps predicting the real world's future, to forget its own past while remembering tomorrow. It is a strange and singular thing, this enormous, decades-long dream of a yellow family in a town that cannot be found, frozen in time and yet reaching forward through it. Perhaps that is the deepest truth hiding in all of this. A show that has run for so long and touched so much inevitably becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting back the culture that made it, the famous people who passed through it, the trends it mocked, and the futures it imagined. Stare into a mirror long enough, and it begins to seem to know things, to anticipate, to see. But the knowing was never magic. It was attention, vast and sustained attention, paid to the world over an enormous span of years, and attention that careful will always, now and then, catch a glimpse of what is coming. The town cannot be found on any map. The family will never age a day. The people slip in and out of being, and still, somehow, the whole strange dream keeps brushing against the real and the yet to come. It is a fitting final mystery for a place built entirely out of mysteries, a town outside of everything that nonetheless cannot stop touching the world it left behind. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.